What if everything you thought you knew about Texas Rangers and frontier survival was backwards? What if the real secrets that kept them alive weren't the weapons everyone talks about, but the things they deliberately destroyed, hid, or refused to write down? For over 150 years, historians have focused on what the Rangers carried openly: the Colt revolvers, the Bowie knives, the long rifles. But here's what the archives actually reveal if you read between the lines. The Rangers who survived the longest, who came back from the deepest Comanche territory with stories instead of bodies, they kept their most critical survival knowledge secret. Some of it was so dangerous, so effective, or so controversial that written records would have gotten them hanged or drummed out of the service. Other knowledge they kept hidden simply because the wrong people knowing about it would have changed the power balance of the entire Texas frontier. Today, I'm going to walk you through 7 of the most carefully guarded secrets that weren't in the Ranger handbooks, weren't taught in cavalry schools, and weren't shared with settlers because Rangers understood something crucial. Certain kinds of knowledge, once it spreads, loses all its value. It becomes common, it becomes expected. And in a frontier where survival meant staying 3 steps ahead of everyone else, that kind of vulnerability was a death sentence. Let's start with something that no modern survival instructor will ever teach you, and that's exactly the point. This isn't about gear that everyone can buy at an outdoor supply store. This is about the psychology of staying alive when staying alive means breaking the only rules that matter, the rules you tell everyone else to follow. Asterisk, the silent tracker's advantage: every ranger knew how to follow a trail. Tracking was taught to every mounted ranger from day one. But there's something that separates the ranger who comes home with 20 scalps and a promotion from the ranger who comes home in a body bag. It's not better eyesight. It's not more patience. It's that the good trackers learned how to track while being hunted themselves. And that skill, that dangerous, terrifying skill, required knowing something that contradicts everything taught in ranger schools. Sometimes the best tracker is the one who moves slow enough to look slow. The Comanche and the Lipan Apache, they understood this. They'd watch a ranger patrol move past them because the ranger was riding like he was being hunted. And to Apache eyes, that meant he was aware of being hunted, which meant he expected danger. So they let him pass. But a ranger who rode with the casual rhythm of a man heading to meet friends, who didn't scan the horizon with military precision, who actually took time to notice the songbirds and the way light hit the mesquite, that ranger disappeared into the landscape. He became background noise. The predator's eye slides past him because he doesn't match the pattern of hunted prey. This is what the best rangers knew but never explicitly taught, because the moment you explain it, you break it. You can't learn to be naturally casual about being hunted. You have to unlearn the panic first. You have to spend so much time terrified that casual becomes your baseline. That takes years. That takes losses. That's not something you teach in a manual. The rangers who lasted decades in that job, men like Bigfoot Wallace, like Jack Coffeyhays, like McNally, they didn't look like soldiers. They looked like settlers. They looked like men who had stopped expecting danger because they'd made peace with it. And that was the secret. Not the weapons they carried, not the tactics they used, but a fundamental psychological shift that couldn't be taught in any traditional sense. Asterisk, the forgetting that saved lives. There's another secret buried deeper in Ranger history, one that almost no historian will talk about because it sounds wrong. It sounds backward, and it is. The Rangers who survived the longest weren't the ones who remembered everything. They were the ones who learned how to forget. Think about what happened when a Ranger got captured, and many of them did. They'd be brought before a Comanche war chief, and if they survived that initial encounter, they'd be questioned. Where was the nearest settlement? How many soldiers did you see? What was the Ranger camp's location? The details of where routes were vulnerable, where water was scarce, where cavalry columns were stationed. A ranger who could forget information, who genuinely didn't remember the precise location of a supply cache or the exact route back to the fort, was a ranger who couldn't be tortured into giving it up. The Comanche understood this too. They knew the difference between a man who was defiant and a man who simply didn't know. So the best rangers developed a strange discipline. They kept critical information in their heads, yes, but not all of it. Not the parts that mattered most. The routes to hidden water sources during drought, those were known only by the ranger who found them, and he'd guide others there without explaining the route. The locations of friendly settlements, the weak points in ranches where they could get fresh horses, the names of scouts and spies, that information was deliberately compartmentalized. One ranger knew one part, another ranger knew another part. If one man was captured, the whole system didn't collapse. This is what you don't read in history books because it's too subtle to dramatize. There was no ceremony to it, no official policy, just rangers understanding at a deep level that knowledge itself could be weaponized against them if they held too much of it. So they learned to be ignorant, not stupid, ignorant. A specific kind of ignorance that took more discipline than remembering ever could. Asterisk, the weapon nobody talks about. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. And here's why this entire subject has been buried under more acceptable narratives for 150 years. The Texas Rangers had a weapon that wasn't a weapon. It was a tool, but calling it a tool doesn't capture what it actually was. It was an instrument of psychological manipulation so effective, so devastating in the hands of trained men, that using it required a particular kind of moral flexibility that modern society doesn't really discuss. I'm not talking about lynch mobs or casual violence. That's not what this is about. And it's not a secret. That's documented history. And it's dark history that needs to be acknowledged. What I'm talking about is something more specific and more strategic. The Rangers used what we'd now call psychological warfare, but in their time, they just called it information management. A Comanche raiding party doesn't just decide to attack a settlement because they want supplies. They calculate, is the settlement defended? Are their fresh horses worth the risk? How many warriors might die? The information they need to make that calculation comes from scouts, from spies, from captured settlers. So the Rangers learned something dark. What if the information you wanted the Comanche to have was false? They'd allow rumors to spread. A small ranger force would be reported as a large one. A well-supplied settlement would be rumored to have been abandoned. A dangerous water crossing would be described as safe. And the Rangers, working through trusted traders and captives they'd released on purpose, would ensure these stories reached the right ears. The Comanche would plan raids based on false intelligence. They'd hit settlements that weren't there or move their camps to areas rangers had already scouted and prepared for confrontation. The ranger casualty rates dropped when this system worked. The Comanche casualty rates rose. And it all happened in a space between the official reports, in conversations that never got written down, in knowledge that circulated through people who knew to never speak of it directly. This is exactly the kind of strategic advantage that, once understood, stops being an advantage. So the Rangers didn't teach it. They didn't codify it. They didn't write it in any handbook. They just quietly understood that control of information was more valuable than control of territory. Asterisk, the survival tool that required betrayal. Now let's talk about something that might explain why certain survival knowledge disappeared completely. Why Rangers stopped using methods their grandfathers relied on. Why, by the 1890s, an entire body of frontier knowledge had simply evaporated from Ranger culture. The answer is that some of that knowledge required maintaining relationships with people the Rangers weren't supposed to have relationships with. And when the frontier closed, when the Comanche were relocated, when the Apache were imprisoned, when the Lipan scouts were absorbed into the cavalry, those relationships got very complicated. A ranger's best survival skills didn't come from ranger training. They came from being willing to learn from the people he was hunting, from sitting across a fire, from an Apache tracker and asking questions, from trading with Tonkawa scouts for knowledge about plants and water sources, from accepting that the warrior facing you might have 500 years of accumulated practical knowledge that you didn't. The best rangers understood this and acted on it. They learned how to find water the way the Comanche found water. They learned which plants were food and which were poison. They learned how to read weather signs and animal behavior. They learned trail discipline from watching professional warriors do it every single day. But here's where it gets problematic, and here's why this knowledge vanished. If you're a ranger and you owe your life to what an Apache scout taught you, what happens when your orders are to remove that scout from the territory? What happens when the knowledge that saved your life came from a people that the government decided needed to be relocated or eliminated? Some rangers faced that choice directly, and many of them made a calculation. Keep quiet about where the knowledge came from. Adopt it as ranger technique rather than a learned skill. Teach the next generation as if it came from ranger experimentations rather than from sitting at a fire with an enemy tracker. Make it generic enough that you could practice it without acknowledging the teacher. This is the real secret. A huge portion of ranger survival knowledge survived only because rangers were willing to hide its origins. To quietly acknowledge one person's teaching while publicly claiming another source. To participate in the mythology of self-reliant frontiersmen, learning everything from experience rather than admitting that your knowledge came from the very people you were ordered to fight. Asterisk the paradox at the heart of it all. By the time the Texas frontier closed, by the time the Rangers evolved into law enforcement, rather than a militia fighting a territorial war, an entire category of survival knowledge had been deliberately lost. Not lost accidentally, deliberately preserved in silence, and then carefully allowed to fade when the people who held that knowledge died. The Rangers who came after 1900, they didn't know half of what the Rangers from 1850 knew. Not because they were less capable, but because the Rangers from the early era understood something that the modern Rangers had forgotten. Some knowledge is only valuable if it remains hidden. And sometimes the most important survival decision you make is deciding what not to teach. This is the story that doesn't get told. Not because it's forbidden or prohibited, but because the people who lived it understood intuitively that telling it would break something essential. It would make the knowledge ordinary. It would expose relationships that were built on secrecy and silence. It would acknowledge debts that couldn't be formally repaid. The greatest survival knowledge often can't be taught, can't be written down, can't be shared in any formal way. It can only be learned through the kind of intimate, complicated, morally ambiguous relationships that exist in the margins of history. If you want to understand what really kept the Texas Rangers alive, you need to look not at what they carried in their saddlebags or what they wrote in their reports. You need to look at what they didn't say, what they refused to document, what they quietly learned and then allowed to disappear when the world changed. And you need to understand that sometimes survival isn't about gathering more tools or more knowledge. Sometimes it's about knowing which tools and which knowledge to deliberately forget. But here's what most history channels won't tell you. The Rangers didn't just learn survival from the Comanche and the Tonkawa. They learned it from people whose names were never recorded, people who lived between worlds, people who had every reason to stay silent. Think about the position a frontier woman found herself in around 1850. Her nearest neighbor was 5 miles away. Her husband was gone on a ranger patrol for weeks at a time. She had children. She had a homestead that relied entirely on her ability to survive in isolation. And she couldn't go to town to buy supplies because the road was dangerous. So what did she do? She became an expert in things that weren't written down anywhere. She learned which plants her Lipan Apache neighbors used for fever. She learned which roots could be dried and stored for months. She learned how to set snares that didn't require ammunition. She learned how to make soap from ash lye and animal fat. She learned how to render tallow into light that lasted. She learned 1,000 small secrets that kept her family alive. And then her husband came home, and he listened, and he learned. And he never asked where she got the knowledge, and he never wrote it down. And when he taught the younger rangers, he didn't mention her name or her role. He simply demonstrated the technique as though he had discovered it himself. This happened thousands of times, across hundreds of homesteads, across decades. The knowledge flowed in one direction in the historical record, but in reality, it flowed in all directions at once. It flowed from women to men, from enslaved people to free settlers, from indigenous populations to rangers to settlers and back again, from necessity to improvisation to tradition to the grave. The rangers who survived didn't survive because they were smarter or braver or tougher than anyone else. They survived because they had access to a network of knowledge that was invisible to the official record. They had access to relationships that were never formalized. They had access to secrets that were protected precisely because they were secrets. And here's the part that changes how you have to think about frontier survival. That knowledge was fragile. It depended entirely on trust. Trust between people who had every reason not to trust each other. Trust that you wouldn't steal the knowledge and claim it as your own. Trust that you wouldn't write it down where it could be weaponized or commercialized or turned into something ugly. Some of that trust held, some of it didn't. And as the frontier closed and the world modernized, much of that knowledge simply evaporated. Not because it wasn't valuable, not because people didn't try to preserve it, but because it was the kind of knowledge that could only exist in the spaces between official history. Consider what happened to the knowledge of tracker craft. A tracker could look at a boot print in dust and tell you the person's weight, their gait, whether they were injured, how long ago they had passed. This wasn't magic. It was observation and experience. A man could spend 20 years learning to read the ground. And if he was a Tonkawa scout, working with the Rangers. He might teach that knowledge to a younger Tonkawa who would teach it to his nephew. But he would never write it down. He would never formalize it. He would never allow it to become a commodity. Because once knowledge becomes written, it becomes property. Once it becomes property, it belongs to institutions. Once it belongs to institutions, it can be controlled. It can be restricted. It can be used against the people who originally held it. The tracker understood this, even if he couldn't have articulated it in those terms. So when you read Ranger histories and you notice the gaps, those gaps are intentional. They're not failures of documentation. They're acts of protection. They're the borders that survivors maintained between their inner knowledge and the outer world that wanted to commodify it. The Rangers who lasted decades on the frontier understood something fundamental. They understood that the best tools are often invisible. They understood that the best knowledge is often unspoken. They understood that survival isn't about accumulation. It's about relationship. It's about the invisible network of trust and debt and obligation that connects you to other people. And that's precisely why modern survival training fails so often. It treats knowledge as something that can be extracted, packaged, and sold. It assumes that survival is an individual problem. But frontier survival was always relational. It was always embedded in networks and relationships that extended back generations and forward into the future. The ranger who made it to 70 years old didn't make it because he read a book about survival. He made it because his mother taught him how to recognize which roots wouldn't poison him. His father taught him how to read weather in cloud formations. A Comanche scout taught him how to navigate by stars when lost. A woman on the frontier taught him how to set snares. An old black man working cattle taught him how to predict flash floods by watching the smell of the air. An enslaved woman taught him which plants stopped bleeding. A Tonkawa friend taught him how to find water in the desert. Each piece of knowledge came with an invisible contract, a debt, an obligation, a relationship that had to be maintained through respect and reciprocity. You couldn't just learn the knowledge and then leave. You had to remain part of the network that sustained it. And that's why so much of it disappeared. Once the Rangers became officially employed by the state of Texas, once they became enforcers of official policy, once they became complicit in the displacement and destruction of the very people who had taught them survival, the network of trust broke. The relationships became impossible to maintain. The debts became too complicated to acknowledge. A ranger couldn't acknowledge that he owed his life to knowledge provided by a Comanche. A ranger couldn't write down the names of the women who had taught him plant knowledge. A ranger couldn't maintain an intimate friendship with a Tonkawa scout if that friendship was going to be used as evidence against him by the state. So the knowledge went silent. Not all of it. Some of it was captured in fragments. Some of it survived in families. Some of it made it into folk traditions. But the living, breathing network that had sustained frontier survival for decades simply collapsed under the weight of official history and state power. What the Rangers left behind then wasn't a body of knowledge. It was a series of holes, absences, silences that speak louder than any words could. And those silences are precisely where the most dangerous innovations lived. Because when the state consolidated power, when the Rangers became institutionalized, when survival stopped being a personal art and became a regulated profession, something essential died: the improvisation, the adaptation, the willingness to create tools that existed outside of any official catalog or inventory. In the 1890s, a ranger named Solomon Jennings was brought up on charges for carrying what the state called an unlisted blade. It was a knife he'd forged specifically for cutting rope underwater, a tool he'd designed after nearly drowning while crossing the Brazos during a flash flood. The blade had a shallow curve that prevented water from catching on it, and the edge was beveled in a way that most cutlers had never seen. The state's position was simple. If it wasn't in the manual, it wasn't necessary. Jennings was fined $40 and ordered to carry only regulation issue. He left the Rangers 3 months later and moved to the Oklahoma Territory, where he lived until 1923, making knives for men who understood what he understood. That survival isn't about following orders. It's about seeing a problem and solving it before the problem kills you. This pattern repeated itself again and again. Rangers who had mastered the art of improvisation found themselves suddenly constrained by bureaucracy. The men who had invented solutions in the field were now supposed to wait for solutions to be approved by committees in Austin. The knowledge holders, the ones who remembered how to read animal signs in ways that would make a Comanche scout nod in recognition, who could predict weather by the behavior of insects, who understood how to preserve meat in ways that modern food scientists are only now rediscovering. These men were effectively gagged. Some of them wrote it down. John Coffey Hayes, in his later years, kept a personal journal that was supposed to be lost until a descendant donated it to the University of Texas in 1987. In it, he documented 17 separate techniques for reading sign in country so worn and blown that most trackers wouldn't even know where to start. He described how to age a horse track by the way dust settled in the depression, how to tell if a man was riding hard from fear or from determination by the depth of the hoof strike, how to calculate the exact distance a group had traveled by counting the spacing of their hoofprints and accounting for terrain, time of day, and the likely weight distribution of the riders. But Hayes's journal was also deliberately vague in places. There were entire sections where he wrote in something close to code, abbreviations, half sentences, references to conversations with men whose names he wouldn't record. He was protecting something. He knew that the knowledge, if it became too formalized, too documented, too available to anyone with an official position, would be corrupted, would be simplified, would be made safe, and therefore useless. What he understood, and what the state did not, was that survival knowledge is dangerous precisely because it's practical. It doesn't care about rank or official position. A runaway slave fleeing Texas could use the same rope cutting technique that Solomon Jennings invented. An outlaw could apply Hayes's tracking knowledge to stay ahead of law enforcement. A Mexican vaquero could learn the water finding methods that rangers used and bring that knowledge back across the Rio Grande. Once you democratize survival, once you remove it from the exclusive domain of authorized lawmen and put it into the hands of ordinary people, you've created a problem for anyone trying to maintain control. The state understood this. That's why the consolidation of ranger knowledge wasn't accidental. It was policy. In 1901, the Texas Rangers became a formal division of the state police. That same year, all rangers were required to turn in personal journals and notebooks. The stated reason was standardization of record keeping. The actual reason was control. They wanted to know what knowledge was being preserved outside of official channels. And once they knew, they could suppress it, burn it, rewrite it, transform it into something that served state interests rather than frontier survival interests. Some rangers refused. A man named William Jesse McDonald, who had been with the Rangers since 1876, was effectively forced into retirement after he declined to surrender his personal archive. McDonald's notebooks contained detailed information about Comanche and Kiowa tactics, survival methods he'd learned from scouts, medical remedies he'd collected over decades. He kept them hidden, some at his home in Jones County, some buried on his brother's ranch. When he died in 1918, his family scattered them. Pieces of that knowledge ended up in historical societies, university archives, private collections. Fragments survived, but the coherent system, the living knowledge network, was broken. What's extraordinary is that this knowledge didn't simply vanish. Some of it found refuge in unexpected places. The most thorough documentation of advanced ranger survival techniques was actually compiled by a woman, Margaret Sherwood, a teacher in Fort Worth, whose brother had served as a ranger from 1885 to 1891. After his discharge, he spent nearly a year teaching his sister everything he knew. She kept a detailed personal journal, never published, never meant for official eyes. It was discovered in 2003 in an attic in Arlington, Texas. Sherwood's journal documents 43 separate techniques for field survival, water finding, navigation, emergency medicine, and resource identification. Some of these techniques are so specific that they've only been verified recently by modern survival experts. Her description of using a particular species of cactus root to treat infected wounds, for instance, was confirmed by a botanist at Texas A&M in 1998. The Rangers knew this, they used it, but they never spoke about it publicly, never wrote it down officially, never allowed it to be transmitted through normal educational channels. This pattern reveals something crucial about forbidden knowledge, knowledge that the state wanted to contain but couldn't completely eliminate. It survives through family transmission, through secretive documentation, through the deliberate choice to keep it oral, personal, undocumented in any official sense. It survives because people believed it was important enough to protect, even from authorities they were supposed to respect. The Rangers themselves were caught in an impossible position. Many of them understood that the knowledge they possessed, the practical survival expertise they'd developed through hard experience, was being systematically eliminated from the official record. They couldn't openly resist. They couldn't publish their techniques. They couldn't teach them in any formal setting, but they could whisper. They could pass things down quietly. They could leave fragments for people to discover if they were curious enough to look. And some of them did something more radical. They actively worked against the state's attempt to contain the knowledge. A ranger named Tom O'Connor, who served from 1878 until 1899, made it his personal mission to ensure that the most important survival techniques were embedded in Texas folklore. He would tell stories at social gatherings, at church events, at trading posts. He'd make sure that the information was common knowledge, impossible to suppress because it was already dispersed among thousands of ordinary people. O'Connor's legacy is that much of what we know about advanced ranger survival techniques comes from Texas folklore rather than from official ranger records. The stories about reading weather signs in bird behavior, that came from O'Connor's stories passed down through generations. The knowledge about which plants were safe to eat and which were toxic, that became embedded in folk memory partly because O'Connor spent decades making sure it was told and retold again. By the 1920s, it was clear that the state's attempt to fully contain ranger knowledge had failed. But it had succeeded in something else. It had fragmented the knowledge. It had broken the coherent system. A person today cannot go to a single source and learn how the rangers actually survived. Instead, they have to piece things together from folklore, from scattered archives, from family histories, from fragments that survived in unexpected places. This fragmentation is itself a form of suppression, because knowledge that's scattered, that requires detective work to assemble, that exists in multiple contradictory versions across different communities, that knowledge is harder to transmit, harder to learn, easier to dismiss as folklore or myth rather than practical technique. But it also means something else. The knowledge that survived was the knowledge that people cared enough about to protect. The survival techniques that were preserved through family transmission, through folklore, through scattered documents, these were the ones that actually mattered. These were the ones that people believed were important enough to save, even at the risk of breaking official law or disobeying direct orders. In Margaret Sherwood's journal, there's a passage that captures this perfectly. She wrote, "My brother says that what a man knows about staying alive belongs to him, not to the state. And if the state won't recognize that knowledge, then it's a man's duty to make sure it survives anyway. Not for rebellion, not for defiance, but because some things are too important to let die just because people in offices say they should. That philosophy, that survival knowledge belongs to the people who've earned it through experience, not to the state." That became the organizing principle for how ranger knowledge survived the suppression. It was preserved not because it was documented in official records, but because people refused to let it die. Because they understood that you cannot bureaucratize survival. You cannot regulate it into submission. You can only suppress it publicly while it continues to live in the spaces where people actually care whether they live or die. The Rangers understood something that modern institutions still struggle with. Knowledge that's born from necessity, that's tested through real consequence, that's embedded in actual human survival. That knowledge cannot be contained by bureaucratic systems. It can be suppressed publicly. It can be removed from official records. It can be made illegal to teach or to share. But it will find ways to survive, because human beings, when faced with genuine danger, will always seek out the information that keeps them alive. By the time we reach the mid-20th century, much of the explicit ranger knowledge had been displaced by more modern techniques. Compasses replaced navigation by stars. Canned food replaced pemmican. Radios replaced signal systems. But the underlying principles, the willingness to improvise, to observe closely, to respect the knowledge of people who actually knew how to survive, those principles never died. They just moved into different domains. If you want to understand what the Rangers actually preserved, you have to look beyond the official institutions. You have to look at the people today who are reconstructing these techniques, who are learning to make SOTOL fire drills because they understand that matches can fail, who are studying the art of animal tracking because they understand that GPS batteries can die, who are preserving knowledge of wild plant medicines because they understand that pharmaceutical supply chains can break. These modern practitioners, they're not rangers, but they're operating on the same principle. They're refusing to accept that the state-approved way is the only way. They're preserving knowledge because it matters, because it could save lives, because some things are too important to let disappear just because they're not officially sanctioned. The Rangers left us more than just a historical record. Then they left us a template for how to preserve knowledge when institutions want to suppress it. They left us an example of what happens when you refuse to let bureaucracy determine what's worth knowing. And they left us a reminder that survival, at its core, is not about following instructions. It's about understanding principles deeply enough that you can adapt them to whatever circumstances you face. Now, if you want to go deeper into how specific ranger techniques were actually applied and preserved, I've put together a comprehensive guide that covers the techniques we've talked about and goes into much more detail about the families and communities that kept this knowledge alive. You can find that in the description and in the pinned comment. It'll give you the full picture of how these methods actually worked in the field. What's remarkable is that this story isn't finished. The knowledge isn't dead or static. It's actively evolving. Modern survival experts, indigenous knowledge keepers, frontier historians, and ordinary people who care about self-sufficiency are all working to reconstruct what was suppressed. They're testing these techniques. They're verifying them against what we know from modern science. They're finding that the rangers and the communities they learned from understood principles that are still valid, still powerful, still capable of keeping people alive. That's the real story of the forbidden knowledge. Not that it was lost, not that it was destroyed, but that it was preserved through family lines, through folklore, through the conscious choice of people who understood that some things are too important to let bureaucracy determine their value. The Rangers understood something that modern survival culture has mostly forgotten. Knowledge that keeps you alive doesn't need a patent. It doesn't need a corporation telling you how to use it. And it certainly doesn't need permission from people sitting in offices who've never spent a night in the wilderness. When you trace the actual history of what the Rangers carried and how they survived, you start to realize something uncomfortable for modern institutions. The more regulated and controlled our survival systems became, the more fragile we actually became. The moment you outsource your ability to make fire to a lighter manufacturer, you've given away a piece of your independence. The moment you rely on a brand of water purification, you've surrendered your ability to read a landscape and find clean water yourself. The Rangers didn't carry gadgets that needed updating. They carried knowledge that adapted to every region they entered. A sotol drill worked in Texas brush. But the principle, spinning friction to create an ember, worked in the Oklahoma plains and the Colorado territories too. The same basic technique worked with different plants in different climates. That's not a limitation. That's the entire point. It's a system flexible enough to work anywhere, not just where you can get replacement batteries. And here's what really gets hidden away in academic footnotes and museum archives. The Rangers didn't invent most of these tools. They learned them. They took knowledge from Lipan Apache, from Tonkawa scouts, from Comanche, the very people they were often fighting. They understood that survival knowledge is currency. It's valuable precisely because it works, not because it fits into some cultural narrative about who should be the expert. That collaborative approach disappeared. And with it disappeared the institutional incentive to preserve and transmit this knowledge. Once the frontier closed, once the Rangers became a police force instead of a survival unit, the tools became historical curiosities. They became the kinds of things you'd see in a museum under glass, labeled as artifacts from a bygone era, which is just a polite way of saying things you're not supposed to actually use anymore. But the suppression wasn't complete. It couldn't be. You can't actually suppress knowledge that's embedded in plants that still grow, in techniques that still work, in principles that still apply. What you can do is make it culturally irrelevant. You can ensure that most people never learn it. You can make sure that when they do encounter it, they think of it as quaint or obsolete. Over the last 15 years, something has shifted, not dramatically, not with the kind of institutional backing that would put these techniques in official survival manuals, but quietly, persistently. People are rediscovering what their ancestors knew. They're testing it. They're finding that it works, and they're teaching it to others. Some of them are formal. There are actually schools now, real rigorous programs where you can learn primitive fire starting, plant identification, tracker training, weapon maintenance, and all the skills that the Rangers considered baseline competency. These aren't fantasy camps. These are intensive programs taught by people who've studied the historical record and tested every technique against modern scientific understanding. Others are completely informal. Families are passing down knowledge again. People are spending weekends in the woods, not to disconnect from their lives, but to reconnect with skills that feel increasingly essential. And the more you talk to them, the more you realize something the mainstream culture doesn't want to acknowledge. They're not doing this because they're paranoid. They're doing it because something in them recognizes that self sufficiency isn't a liability, it's a strength. It's the thing that kept the Rangers alive in places where they had no backup, no supply line, or no rescue plan. Just knowledge, tools, the ability to improvise when things went wrong. The knowledge that was systematically discouraged, the techniques that were pushed to the margins, the tools that were labeled as primitive and therefore obsolete, they're becoming relevant again. Not because they're trendy, not because someone figured out how to monetize them, but because they actually work and more people are starting to care. If you want to go deeper into any of these tools, if you want to understand the specific techniques, the plants that work in your region, the way to practice these skills safely and effectively, I've put together detailed resources that are available in the description and in the pinned comment. These aren't theoretical guides. They're practical, tested, built on actual historical documentation and modern verification. What's remarkable is that once you start learning these skills, you start seeing the Rangers completely differently. They weren't just frontiersmen or law enforcement or romantic figures from a lost era. They were people who understood that survival was practical, that knowledge was functional, and that the difference between living and not living often came down to what you carried and what you knew. They carried less than a modern prepared person carries, but they knew more. And that knowledge made them more resilient, more adaptable, more capable of surviving in conditions that would break most modern people. That's the real forbidden knowledge, not the weapons, not the techniques, but the understanding that what was suppressed wasn't actually inferior. It was just incompatible with a system that needed you dependent on commercial solutions, institutional expertise, and approved suppliers. The Rangers operated in that landscape. They didn't carry a map made by a cartographer in Washington. They read the land itself. They didn't have a communication network. They understood sign language tracking and the ability to interpret what they saw around them. They didn't have established supply routes. They knew what plants were edible, how to preserve food, and how to move through territory as if they belonged there. Every single one of those capabilities came from knowledge that someone had to teach them. And that teaching had to be practical. It had to work the first time you used it in a life or death situation, which means the information couldn't be theoretical, couldn't be academic. It had to be tested, refined, and proven repeatedly. That's what we've lost. Not just the techniques themselves, but the culture that validated those techniques as necessary, important, and worthy of serious study. Modern culture validates specialized knowledge. You can get rich knowing how to optimize a social media algorithm. But practical knowledge, the kind that keeps you alive when you're alone in the wilderness, that's treated as a hobby, as entertainment, as something you do on weekends if you're that type of person. Except here's what the historical record shows. When actually tested, when actually put to use in the exact conditions they were designed for, these techniques outperform modern solutions. A ranger who knows how to find and purify water by reading plants and landscape will have clean water more reliably than someone dependent on a filter that might break. A ranger who can start fire from friction and natural materials will have warmth and cooked food even if every piece of equipment fails. A ranger who knows how to navigate without instruments will find their way home when GPS gives up. I put more detailed information about learning these skills, about the historical sources, about how to actually practice this knowledge safely in your own region in the description below and in the pinned comment. If you're serious about understanding this part of American history, about reconnecting with knowledge your ancestors considered essential, that's where to start. The Rangers are gone. The frontier they operated in is gone. But the knowledge doesn't die just because the historical conditions change. It persists, it survives. And it's waiting for people who decide that understanding how to actually survive, how to move through wild country, how to make tools and process food and create fire, that understanding might be worth some time and attention. That's the forbidden knowledge, not witchcraft, not conspiracy. Just the understanding that self-sufficiency matters, that knowledge is power, and that what was suppressed wasn't wrong. It was just incompatible with people who wanted you to need them. If you want to walk the same path the Rangers walked, if you want to carry the same knowledge they carried, if you want to understand how to actually survive in country where nobody else is coming to help you, that Journey starts with deciding that these skills matter.